Well, Mr. President, since the real president, President Biden, was elected to office, the southern border, which my state shares a 1,200-mile common border with Mexico, that border has been absolutely overwhelmed by the number of migrants entering the United States. The United States is the most generous country in the world when it comes to legal immigration. We naturalize almost 1 million people a year, which is, I think, part of the secret to our economic success. We see the best and the brightest from all around the world want to come to America, want to enjoy the kind of prosperity that Americans enjoy and the freedom and opportunity to pursue their dreams. So legal immigration, I think, has been part of the secret sauce that has helped make our country great, and we need to protect that. Illegal immigration is a disaster. What's happening now on the border and has happened the last 2 years under the Biden administration has been nothing short of a humanitarian and public safety crisis. It's a little bit of a disappointment. It's more than a little bit of a disappointment when President Biden campaigned on the promise of policies that were sure to lead to this exact situation. But on one hand, he said, I want to be a uniter. I want to work together to solve our nation's problems. But then to see him completely abdicate the federal government's responsibility to control uncontrolled migration across the border is inexcusable. Once President Biden took office, his administration continued to send a clear message to the cartels, to the human smugglers, and to the migrants that our border was open. Oh, don't forget the drug cartels who depend on an open border to sell their poison all across our country, taking the lives last year of 108,000 Americans alone. And some people have said, well, apparently every state's now a border state, and I think that's true, particularly when you see the epidemic of fentanyl so pervasive in all our communities. We're losing students in our high schools on a regular basis who think they're taking something like let's say a Xanax or a Percocet or something else, but it's laced with fentanyl and it kills them, because only a very small piece of fentanyl can take your life. It's that powerful. Unfortunately, the administration is now trying to play catch up to its failures and abdication to provide security across our southern border. Last fiscal year, for the first time on record, annual border encounters reached nearly 2.4 million. And when I say border encounters, that does not count the so-called getaways, which is what the Border Patrol calls them. Hundreds of thousands of people who don't turn themselves in claiming asylum. These are people who want to evade law enforcement, very likely involved either criminal activity, having a criminal record themselves, or perhaps just smuggling drugs into the United States. Those are the getaways. So up to 2.4 million is a low number for the number of people that's come across the border in the last 2 years. And there's no indication that things are slowing down. I know that Vice President Harris, who was named the border czar for President Biden's administration, when she talks about immigration, she says, well, we need to get back to the root causes. And she talks to the president of Guatemala or Honduras or El Salvador and says, well, we need to make life better for people there so they don't come here, which is totally ignoring the scope and the gravity of the human smuggling networks that operate internationally. I mentioned this morning in the Judiciary Committee, where the presiding officer was too, that Border Patrol regularly encounter people from as many as 150 different countries. So the fact is, the criminal organizations that make money on human smuggling We'll smuggle you from anywhere in the world, including countries of particular concern to us when it comes to terrorism, for a price. So where if you're coming from Central America or Mexico, it may cost you $5,000 or $10,000. If you're coming from Pakistan, Iraq, Iran, it may cost you $15,000. And it goes on and on and on and on. So Vice President Harris apparently doesn't understand what we're up against when she talks about root causes. People want to come here, and they'll pay to come here, and to evade a lawful system of controlled legal immigration, which, as I said, has been a good thing for our country in favor of transnational criminal organizations getting richer by the day, smuggling people from all around the world, along with the drugs that I mentioned earlier that took the lives of 108,000 Americans last year alone. In fiscal year 2018, we saw an average of 43,000 migrants at the border every month. That's 2018, 4 years ago, 43,000. Fiscal year 2022, fast forward 4 years, the monthly total has skyrocketed from 43,000 to 198,000 a month. We're seeing 4.5 times more people coming every single month, and not surprisingly, the Border Patrol can't keep up. And this is part of the strategy of these transnational criminal organizations. They will send children unaccompanied to the border, knowing that the Border Patrol, as they should, are going to try to take care of these children as they process the asylum system. But what that means is they're not on the border when they're back filling out paperwork or changing diapers, and that's when the drug cartels come through. And it's like a 4-lane highway into the United States. And it doesn't stop, Mr. President, it doesn't stop in Texas. It goes to New Jersey, it goes to Illinois, it goes to all across our country. Not to mention that the Border Patrol doesn't have the space to house this many people, so they simply let them go. In many instances, with a notice to appear for a future court hearing if somebody invokes asylum laws, but they don't have the personnel to control this humanitarian crisis, this flood of humanity coming across the border. And as I said, the people coming across are a hodgepodge. Some economic migrants, and we can understand people fleeing poverty or violence. We're human beings too, we understand that. But it also creates the opportunity for criminals and drug smuggling and other nefarious actors to come across, because we don't know who is coming across, because there's so many of them. They've overwhelmed our capacity to monitor, and hundreds of thousands of them simply are the gotaways. So we don't have enough people to do the jobs patrolling the front lines and arresting people who need to be arrested and interdicting the drugs that need to be interdicted. I know Chairman Durbin, our friend and colleague from Illinois, mentioned this morning in the Judiciary Committee hearing the fact that the Customs and Border Protection have interdicted tons of drugs. And that's a good thing. But nobody's under any illusion that they've gotten anywhere near all, much less the majority of the drugs that come across the border. They haven't. And so this is, unfortunately, another manifestation of the broken policies of the Biden administration and the Biden border crisis. We don't have enough immigration courts to keep up with the backlog as people are released by the millions into the United States and told to appear for a court hearing. Last figures I saw showed that about half of the people didn't show up for their court hearing. But there's no effort made to follow up by Immigration and Customs Enforcement to repatriate those people who don't comply with their notice to appear. But honestly, there's millions of cases in the backlog, and the cartels know that too. And this is another way for them to game the system. And this is another incentive for people to come. You know, that Border Patrol talks about the push factors, violence, poverty, things that cause people to want to leave their home to go somewhere else. But they also talk about the pull factors, the perception that the border is open and there's no impediment to people coming here outside of our legal immigration system. That's another reason why the numbers are so huge, because there's simply no deterrence. And as I said, this isn't just a problem in Texas and other border states. My border communities don't have the resources to help each and every migrant who arrives penniless, malnourished, and maybe without any place to really go. So the truth is, the entire system is buckling under the weight of this border crisis. But if you think things are bad now, they're about to get worse. Earlier this week, a D.C. District Court judge vacated the Center for Disease Control Title 42 order. You'll remember Title 42 is a public safety order which empowered the Border Patrol to turn back people coming across the border into the United States, because infectious diseases can spread when people who haven't been vaccinated, who aren't tested, are released into the interior of the United States. And so this is a public health order that enabled the Border Patrol at least to use that tool to try to modulate the flow of humanity coming across the border. But a district judge here has vacated Title 42 now. The judge has granted a 5-week stay, giving the Department of Homeland Security until midnight on December the 21st to come up with a new plan. But this isn't a time to start scrambling and come up with a plan. It should have been happening years ago. I still remember meeting with the Border Patrol leadership and Customs and Border Protection, and they said when Title 42 goes away, if we are denied that tool to be able to control the flow of illegal immigration, we will lose control. There will be no disincentive for people not to come across the border in the United States illegally. Title 42 has been one of the few remaining tools that have been used to prevent even greater chaos than what I've described. And now, with it potentially, likely going away, even that tool will be lost. But of course, the administration has jettisoned almost every policy we had in place to secure the border and discourage migrants from undertaking the dangerous journey to our southern border. Title 42 has given the Department of Homeland Security the ability to quickly expel some migrants, usually adult males, and to prevent our border facilities and local communities from becoming even more overwhelmed than they already are. Once this authority goes out the window, and that appears to be imminent, the situation is going to get much, much worse. Of the more than 230 encounters at the southern border last month, more than 78,000 were removed under Title 42. 230,000 encounters, 78,000 removed using Title 42. But if Title 42 goes away, that's 78,000 more people each month who are likely then to make their way into the United States. Title 42 also provided some means to control the need to process, house, and feed migrants coming across the border. But now, with all of the restraints of Title 42 off, it's going to get much and much worse, and the consequences will be dire indeed. Well, as I said, The Biden border crisis is entirely predictable, and it's a result of the Biden administration dismantling what few tools that were available to Border Patrol and to the U.S. government to control unrestricted access to the United States. And it seems to me the only consistent policy of the Biden administration has been whatever the previous administration did, whether it's build infrastructure, provide more technology, more boots on the ground. Whatever the policy of the previous administration was, we're going to do the opposite. Not because it makes sense, just because the previous administration did it. They're going to undo it. And of course, those people who do claim asylum are met with a 2 million case backlog. And on average, it takes about 2 years for the case to be adjudicated. But migrants know this. They plan on this. This is how part of the sales pitch of the human smugglers. Said, just go to the border and claim asylum, and then you'll be put in a queue of 2 million people, and you have to wait for your case to be called. Well, of course, more than half of the people don't show up. That's part of the plan. And those who do show up, we know that 90% of those cases fail to meet the legal standard for asylum. In the meantime, those migrants who, if they'd had their case adjudicated, would have found they had no legal basis to stay in the United States. They are able to live and work here for years. In the meantime, I mentioned the notice that many migrants are given to appear for a court date, but because of the volume of people coming across at one point, the Border Patrol and Customs and Border Protection didn't even issue those notices to appear for a date certain for a court setting. And they gave migrants a notice to report. So these are people who have evaded the legal process to make their way into the United States, and we give them a slip of paper that say, oh, when you get to where you're going, whether it's Chicago or New York or Washington, D.C., go turn yourself in to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. I just don't know how stupid the Biden administration thinks the American people are. Because the American people are not stupid. They understand that this notice to report is another means for people to make their way illegally into the United States and to stay here. And it's an incentive for more and more people to come. You know, law enforcement is not just enforcing the law, it's actually sending a message of deterrence. Don't do that. And we've lost all message of deterrence because migrants who make their way in the United States, they call back home, they say, I made it. They watch TV, they see the migrants flowing across the border unrestricted. They say, well, I guess if they can do it, I can do it too. Given the massive influx of people coming across the border every day, the Border Patrol's facilities are completely underwater. Rather than stand up new facilities or hire more personnel to make the expedited removal process function properly, the Biden administration has just continued to release more and more people into the interior of the country. In many cases, these people are released without any real information about who they are, where they're going, and what they're going to do when they get there. Senator Langford and I have asked the Government Accountability Office to evaluate the impact of these practices, and the results are pretty shocking. The GAO reported that some of the migrants had their appointment with ICE scheduled for August 2024, 2 years from now, nearly 2 years from now. And that was just the appointment to receive the notice to appear, which begins the proceedings in immigration court. Tack on the average of a 2-year process for a single case to be adjudicated by an immigration judge, and you're looking at a 4-year plus waiting period. If the administration doesn't come up with a plan to fix these problems before Title 42 is lifted, we'll be looking at a pull factor to end all pull factors. Here's why. Earlier this year, Secretary Mayorkas said that Customs and Border Protection detention facilities could hold approximately 18,000 people. Now that sounds like a big number, but those beds fill up quickly. And once Title 42 goes away, every single person who crosses the border will have to be processed by the Border Patrol. The administration previously said we could see as many as 18,000 migrants every day if Title 42 was lifted. That's a day. So all 18,000 of those beds could fill up as a result of a single day's migration. And the question comes, what do we do to the rest when the only detention facilities we have are full? So when these facilities are filled to capacity, agents are left with no other choice. The migrants are released, which is, again, part of the business model of the human smugglers and transnational criminal organizations that operate these illegal smuggling networks. They realize that they have overwhelmed the capacity of the Border Patrol and the United States policy to keep people who should not come into the country out. They may be given a notice to appear, but that is a document that tells asylum seekers when and where to present their claims in court. Or they may be paroled into the country and enrolled in a so-called alternatives to detention program. Years are likely to pass before that long-awaited court date arrives, and when it does, maybe the person will show up, maybe they won't. But either way, one thing is certain. When word gets out, as it always does, that migrants are being released from custody, more illegal immigration will follow. This creates a huge public safety risk, not because of the migrants themselves, but because of the chaos that mass migration creates. When thousands of people are crossing the border every day, it completely overwhelms the Border Patrol, as I said. If agents are caring for unaccompanied children, they can't patrol the front lines. If they're knee-deep in paperwork, they can't stop dangerous criminals, people with criminal records, from slipping across the border. The chaos at our southern border provides an excellent disguise for dangerous individuals. Gangs, cartels, criminal organizations are paying close attention to the state of our border. They see the gaps, and they know how to exploit them. Every day, cartel and gang members attempt to sneak across the border. The dedicated men and women of the Border Patrol arrest a number of them. Last fiscal year, agents apprehended more than 750 gang members. But as we know, law enforcement's overwhelmed. And that means countless others have been undetected and slipped through the cracks. Now, Mr. President, no one is suggesting that Title 42 is a permanent solution or a partial solution to our border security problems. Far from it. But the administration should have been planning years ago for the day that Title 42 would be lifted, because once Title 42 is lifted, unless other policies that are put in place for expedited removal of people who cannot legally enter the country, for example, we're going to lose control of the border entirely. But the administration has shown zero interest in working with Congress to craft real change. That needs to change. Before Title 42 goes away, the administration must implement a serious plan quickly and efficiently, and yes, fairly, to enforce our immigration laws at the border and deter further illegal immigration. They need to ensure that Border Patrol facilities are equipped with the resources and the personnel needed to manage the massive influx of migrants. But the fact of the matter is, those overwhelmed Border Patrol agents, those overwhelmed facilities, those overwhelmed border communities need policies that can only be passed by Congress and signed into law by the President of the United States. But so far, our Democratic colleagues have shown zero interest, turned a blind eye, really, to any of these concerns about unrestricted flow of humanity across our border. Again, of course, with the drugs that the cartels sell here in the United States. So the administration needs to change their approach. I saw they forced the resignation of the head of Customs and Border Protection, the former police chief, I believe, in Arizona. But this is just scapegoating. They're firing him, hoping people won't realize that what's really failing is not the officials heading up these government agencies, it's the administration, it's the policies of the Biden administration itself, and the failure of our Democratic colleagues to work with us to try to come up with solutions. And I'm not just here complaining. I'm here offering constructive proposals. More than a year ago, Senator Sinema, who happens to represent a border state of Arizona, a Democrat, Henry Cuellar from Laredo, Texas, a Texas Democrat, and Tony Gonzalez, a Republican congressman, we came up with a bipartisan Border Solutions Act. Something that would not solve all the problems, but it would be a modest first step in the right direction. But what we are told by our Democratic colleagues is they're not interested in that, or at least they're not interested in any solutions until and unless you provide a pathway to citizenship for millions of people here in the country without proper documentation. In other words, illegal migrants, people who've broken our laws. They want a mass amnesty. And they still don't want to change the policies that are creating this influx of humanity across the border. Our Democratic colleagues have had the White House, they've had majorities in the House and the Senate. They have Democratic colleagues who are chairing the committees in the House and the Senate who could actually mark up and pass legislation to deal with this crisis. And maybe you can't do it all in one piece of legislation. Maybe you can just do it one step at a time. But they have done none of that. Zero, zip, nada. And the only conclusion you can reach in the face of this failure to respond to this acknowledged crisis is that they don't care. Well, I can guarantee you the American people care. The parents who lose children as a result of fentanyl overdoses because of the unrestricted flow of illegal drugs across the border, they care. Our major cities and rural areas of the country that have experienced a spike in the prevalence of drug distribution and violent crime, they care, because the distribution network for the drugs that come across the border is all across the United States, mainly operated by criminal gangs. who are responsible for a lot of other criminal conduct and a lot of the gun violence and deaths you see every weekend, for example, in cities like Chicago. Those are criminal gangs fueled by the broken border and the Biden border crisis. Something's got to change, Mr. President. I don't know what it is. I don't know what it's going to take for the Democratic leadership at the White House or the Senate or the House to say enough is enough. Ultimately, I know that power lies with the American people. They can change, or they can change their elected representatives in the next election. So something's going to give. The status quo is not sustainable. The country, the border is on fire. People are dying. And we're straining the whole legal system that is designed to expedite the entry of people through a legal process and turning the reins over to the transnational criminal organizations and international drug networks that profit hugely by the failure of Congress and the failure of the White House to act.